Imagine a village where the entire population gathers in the town square. Masks, music, food that smells suspicious, and games that could maim you all in the name of festival fun. Welcome to Medieval Festivals, where chaos and culture collide every year. We're diving into a world of street performers, costume parades, jousts, pies flying through the air, and peasants drinking ale straight from barrels. Prepare for the smells, sights, and sheer madness of medieval public life. Picture this: a village square bustling with life, the smell of smoke from fires mingling with the tang of fresh straw, the laughter of children, the occasional bray of a goat, and the relentless hum of human activity. It's a time of year when survival, work, and toil momentarily take a back seat, because the festival is here. But not just any festival, this is a medieval festival. A chaotic, colorful, slightly terrifying, and occasionally sticky celebration that is part spiritual ritual, part social necessity, and part excuse to eat pastries without guilt. Now, the origins of these medieval festivals are a tangled web of religion, agriculture, superstition, and plain old human stubbornness. Villagers didn't just invent festivals because someone liked parades. No, the roots stretch back centuries to the rhythms of the land. Before the local lord ever claimed ownership over the village, and before the church dictated moral order, people celebrated the harvest, the solstice, the waxing and waning of the moon, and the simple fact that they had survived another brutal winter. Survival itself was festival-worthy. When your barn didn't collapse in the snow, and your granary still held a sack or two of grain, that called for dancing and singing, and possibly throwing pies at the first person who reminded you of taxes. As Christianity spread across Europe, many of these ancient pagan celebrations didn't just disappear. That would have been too easy, and humans love a good party too much. Instead, they were absorbed, rebranded, and slightly rewritten to fit the new holy calendar. Suddenly, those solstice dances around a fire turned into Saints' Day processions, and offerings to the earth goddess became church-approved feasts for local patrons. So you might start the morning thinking you're celebrating a bumper wheat harvest, and by noon, you're kneeling for Saint Whatever's blessing, wondering why there's a goat in your pew. And the seasons dictated much of this. Spring festivals were about fertility and growth. Fields needed to be blessed. Animals needed protection. And everyone needed a reason to put down their tools and, for a moment, not worry about frost or famine. Summer festivals celebrated the high point of work. The fields were lush, the granaries partially full, and people had enough energy left in their aching bodies to pretend that life wasn't one endless slog. Autumn festivals were the grand finale, the harvest itself. Corn, wheat, apples, cabbages, and occasionally a pig if you were lucky, were honored with feasts, dances, and games that could easily end in a black eye or a broken finger. And winter festivals? Well, they were as much about enduring the dark days as they were about celebrating Christmas, Yule, or some other saint you vaguely recognized from the local church calendar. Let's not forget that medieval peasants had a very different sense of fun than we do today. There were no theme parks, no popcorn, no TikTok to distract them. Fun was messy, dangerous, and often involved standing in the mud while someone swung a club pretending to be a giant rabbit, or trying to catch a greased pig that everyone was laughing at, including the pig, probably. In short, festivals were a combination of religion, chaos, and practical survival. Dancing was not just entertainment. It was an exercise to strengthen muscles and lungs for winter. Eating was a brief respite before the next day of back-breaking labor. And if you managed to survive the games without falling into a cow dung pile, that was considered a personal triumph worthy of bragging to your neighbors for weeks. The social function of festivals was just as important as the religious or agricultural significance. Villagers came together not just to pray or to feast, but to reinforce bonds. Marriages might be arranged in the square, apprentices were recruited for the coming season, and debts could be negotiated over a cup of spiced ale. In a society where most life was about survival and hierarchy, the festival was a rare space where some semblance of equality could exist, if only for a day. Even the Lord might wander the square, allowing peasants a glimpse of the elite, while ensuring no one stole his best goat or his daughter, if the stories are true. Of course, the calendar was crowded, and the church had plenty of saints' days. Some villages had festivals for nearly every month, which meant that peasants could spend more time preparing for the festival than actually working in the fields. And preparation was no joke. Stalls had to be built, pies baked, ale brewed, and costumes fashioned from whatever scraps were available. Masks, ribbons, and odd hats were thrown together, sometimes resembling local animals, sometimes resembling abstract concepts like luck or the devil, depending on the imagination and sobriety of the craftsman. Children were roped into this chaos as apprentices in mischief, chasing chickens or juggling root vegetables, while adults balanced the line between fun and disaster. One misthrown pie could spark a feud lasting years. The food served at these festivals deserve a special mention. The medieval diet was generally bland, boring, and extremely utilitarian, but festival foods were designed to be a sensory explosion in comparison. Roasted meats, pies bursting with mystery fillings, fried dough, and ale so thick it could double as porridge were all on the menu. It was calorie-dense, messy, and often slightly toxic, but who cared? The festivals were brief, and survival was easier with sugar, fat, and alcohol coursing through your veins. Even the local sweet treats were experimental, sometimes delicious, sometimes fatal, and often sticky enough to ensure your fingers were glued together for hours, making subsequent games more challenging. Costumes added to the chaos. Villagers dressed as animals, saints, demons, or characters from local legends. Nobles occasionally joined in, often drunk, often poorly disguised, adding an unpredictable layer to the festivities. One moment, you might be playing a game of tag with your cousin, and the next, a masked nobleman might vault over the pie stall, spilling stew everywhere. This combination of food, drink, costumes, and physical exertion meant that injuries were common. Bruised ribs, sprained ankles, or the occasional broken nose were the trophies of participation. And let's not forget the role of superstition. Festivals were full of rituals designed to ensure good fortune, jumping over fires to guarantee fertility, tossing grain into the river to honor a local water spirit, or whispering secrets to the church bell to ward off witches. These were serious business. Ignoring the ritual could mean crop failure, illness, or the mysterious disappearance of a family chicken. In this world, faith, fear, and fun were inseparable, and humorously, peasants often didn't know which was which. Music played a key role too. Minstrels, drummers, and village bands accompanied dances and games, setting the rhythm for the chaos. The tunes were catchy, loud, and occasionally repetitive enough to make everyone question their life choices. The dances themselves ranged from structured circle dances to more free-form, energetic contests where someone inevitably tripped over another's skirt or ended up in the mud. And yet, the shared experience, the laughter, the competitive shouting, the minor injuries, helped reinforce the communal bonds essential for survival in such a harsh society. Over time, festivals evolved from strictly religious observances to elaborate community spectacles. While honoring saints or marking agricultural cycles remained important, the inclusion of games, food fairs, performances, and drunken antics ensured that no one could take life too seriously, at least for a day. It was a delicate balance between devotion and debauchery, between sacred and absurd, that somehow defined the medieval experience. By the end of a festival day, villagers were exhausted, sticky, bruised, slightly intoxicated, and thoroughly entertained. Children had learned a little about balance, speed, and mischief. Adults had reaffirmed social hierarchies, negotiated trades, and survived public humiliation with their dignity mostly intact. And everyone had, at least briefly, tasted a life unburdened by survival. A life where laughter and chaos coexisted with faith and tradition. Humor was never far from the festivities. Someone inevitably tripped over a goat, spilled ale on the mayor, or got a pie in the face while wearing a ridiculous costume. The mishaps were part of the fun, a reminder that life, even in the harsh medieval countryside, could be absurd, unpredictable, and occasionally joyful. As one might put it, you start celebrating the harvest and end up honoring a saint you've never heard of, or a dancing goat. And so, the origins of medieval festivals are a story of necessity, survival, religion, and a human desire to celebrate, connect, and briefly escape the brutal realities of everyday life. Festivals were about food, faith, fun, fear, and foolishness, all rolled into one messy, glorious event. For the peasant, it was a day to forget toil, to bond with neighbors, and to experience a fleeting sense of freedom in a world where freedom was rare. In this first glimpse into the medieval festival, we see the ingenuity, resilience, and humor of the people who lived in a world that demanded creativity in work, food, and play. They celebrated because they had to, because life was hard, and because, when the wheat was harvested, the fire was lit, and the ale was poured, even the poorest villager could feel alive. Once the food smells began to mingle with the earthy aroma of the village square, and the music from lutes, drums, and fiddles pulsed through the cobblestones, it was time for everyone's favorite part of the festival: costumes. Oh yes, costumes were not merely decoration. They were identity theft, social commentary, and occasionally a recipe for minor chaos all rolled into one. The tradition of dressing up stretched back centuries, blending pagan rituals, religious pageantry, and human inventiveness. By the time the festival hit full swing, you could look around the square and see a whirlwind of color: fur, feathers, straw, and occasionally mud, all in the name of merrymaking. Villagers took costumes seriously, though their concept of serious often included the expectation that someone, probably a child or drunk neighbor, would get trampled, hit by a pie, or accidentally set a haystack on fire. Masks were everywhere. Some were simple, carved from wood or sewn from cloth, shaped into exaggerated faces, animals, or grotesque demons designed to scare off evil spirits, or the occasional nosy lord. Others were elaborate, sewn with beads, feathers, and whatever bits of ribbon were lying around, showing that someone actually had time, skill, and patience before realizing that the festival lasted a single day, after which the costume would be tossed into the mud and never seen again. The whole point of the masquerade was reversal. Nobles would sometimes don the rough garb of peasants' patched tunics, oversized boots, or straw hats, and wander the square pretending they were just like everyone else, though they were never convincing. There was always that tiny flicker of privilege, the knowledge that if something went wrong, their castle awaited them, safe and comfortable. Peasants, on the other hand, could dress like kings, knights, or even high priests, and for the length of the festival, they commanded authority, if only symbolically. Children were given the role of tiny jesters, running around, squealing, tripping over skirts, and throwing handfuls of grain into the air because, well, why not? Some costumes were intentionally ridiculous, serving as social commentary. Wearing a donkey mask to mock a pompous mayor, or stuffing your tunic with hay to resemble an overstuffed noble, was an act of rebellion wrapped in humor. The audience, fellow villagers, travelers, and occasionally a lord willing to tolerate satire, would laugh, cheer, and sometimes hiss, depending on which side of the joke they stood. The village blacksmith might dress as a monk, wagging a finger at passers-by while swinging a wooden mallet for dramatic effect, and the baker might strut around as a knight, wielding a rolling pin like a sword. And then there were the fools. Not just your usual village idiot, though they existed, but professional or semi-professional performers whose job was to exaggerate everything. These individuals would wobble, prance, stumble, and occasionally fall into the ale barrel for laughs, proving that human physics, gravity, and sticky floors were all part of the performance. Some fools carried wooden swords. Others carried large bells that rang constantly. And some had flutes that squeaked painfully but with dramatic flair. Every jester or fool added a layer of chaos to the already cacophonous environment. Role reversals weren't just for fun. They were a brief, sanctioned suspension of social norms. For one afternoon, a serf could lord over the local priest in jest, or a nobleman could be tripped by a tiny child dressed as a bear. The hilarity came from the contrast, from seeing someone take themselves seriously only to be outwitted, outdanced, or out-pie-ed by a neighbor with a mischievous grin. Of course, nobody wanted to cross the real power structure entirely. There was a delicate balance between harmless fun and disastrous disrespect. Step over the line and suddenly the mayor, or worse, the Lord himself, would remind you that punishment was still a very real, very medieval thing. The chaos was compounded by movement. Dances, games, parades, and impromptu competitions meant that costumed villagers were constantly bumping into each other. Long skirts, headdresses, and animal masks made visibility poor, so collisions were frequent. Someone in a wolf mask might scare a group of children into running into a pie stall, splattering sweet cream and fruit filling across their own robes. A young noble, pretending to be a peasant, could trip over a dog disguised as a goat, landing in the mud and eliciting hoots from the audience. These weren't accidents. They were expected, and they were celebrated as part of the festival's charm. Children, of course, took this chaos to an art form. They were the ones who invented new games on the spot. Tag while wearing oversized hats, capture the chicken in full costume, and chase each other around the market stalls while avoiding the drunks with jugs of ale in hand. Their mischief was tolerated because it added to the general merriment, and because everyone secretly remembered their own childhood antics during the festival. Masks served more than entertainment. They were protection. Literally. If a pie, stick, or rotten vegetable came flying, the mask could take the hit. Symbolically, the mask allowed a person to step outside of their social role. For that brief festival, a peasant could embody nobility, a fool could speak truths to a lord, and everyone could laugh at the absurdity of hierarchical life. By the end of the day, the masks might be smeared with food, sweat, or mud, but the effect was transformative. Temporary chaos became communal joy. And then there was the matter of the animals. Goats, pigs, and occasionally chickens wandered into the square, whether intentionally incorporated into games or escaping from pens. Masks on humans sometimes startled animals into unpredictable movements, leading to the classic slapstick moments. A goat chasing a noble in a bear suit, a pig tumbling into a stall, a rooster landing on a jester's head. It was messy, noisy, and perfect. Food fights, almost inevitable by mid-afternoon, were considered a highlight. Roasted meat, pies, bread, and ale were hurled not just for nourishment but as entertainment. By the time the sun began to set, participants were sticky, smelly, bruised, and euphoric. A testament to the human desire for levity, even amidst hardship. The peasants, the nobles, the performers, all were equalized briefly by mud, ale, and laughter. The whole experience reinforced social bonds. Shared laughter over costumes, shared danger when tripping over a root or bumping into a horse, and shared storytelling afterward about who had the best disguise or the worst accident. All of this wove the village into a tighter fabric. Even disputes were softened when viewed through the lens of festival absurdity. That pie in your face wasn't an insult. It was tradition. That masked noble who tripped over your child wasn't arrogant. They were participating in centuries-old ritual chaos. By evening, the square was littered with evidence of the day's events. Trampled hay, smashed pies, overturned barrels, lost shoes, and a general sense of disheveled happiness. Children clutched remnants of their costumes. Parents tried to wrangle livestock, and the last of the fools bowed dramatically as the musicians played the final tune. Laughter faded into contented groans, and the villagers returned to their homes, sticky, tired, and entirely satisfied that they had survived another festival. It was messy. It was absurd. It was, in every sense, medieval. Costumes, masks, role reversals, and the sheer unpredictability of human and animal interaction created a living tapestry of joy, rebellion, and chaos. For that brief interlude, the social hierarchy was playful, the burdens of survival temporarily forgotten, and the village was alive with laughter, color, and slightly questionable hygiene. Nothing says fun like wearing a donkey mask and accidentally hitting the mayor with a pie, and yet, somehow, it was perfect. And as night fell, lanterns flickering across the mud-strewn square, peasants, nobles, and fools alike tucked themselves into beds, grateful for warmth, quiet, and the brief respite that comes only after a day of complete, glorious, chaotic immersion. Tomorrow, they would return to the fields, the barns, and the unrelenting rhythm of medieval life. But tonight, masks, laughter, and mayhem reigned supreme. As the festival's energy swirled around, there was one undeniable constant: the smell. The heady scent of roasting meat, frying dough, and something vaguely herbal mixed with the wafting undertones of sweat, spilled ale, and, let's face it, unwashed bodies. The village square had become a sensory battlefield, where every corner was occupied by a food stall, a wandering vendor, or a couple of tipsy peasants trying to turn a poorly baked loaf into a makeshift feast. Now, let's talk about the food. It wasn't exactly Michelin star quality, but in the context of medieval life, it was downright luxurious. The real treat was what you could eat while walking around, talking to friends, or participating in a game that involved throwing rotten vegetables at your neighbor. Because, yes, that was a thing. These were the foodstuffs that kept the people going, from the moment the first bells of morning rang to the time when the last embers of the fire were snuffed out. First, let's talk about the meat pies. Meat pies. They were the holy grail of medieval street food. What was inside? Well, that was always a bit of a mystery. Was it beef? Pork? Something more exotic like hare or venison? Or perhaps more realistically, it was a random mix of whatever meat the butcher had left at the end of the day. Possibly the tough bits, the scraps, or, occasionally, the mystery meats no one was quite brave enough to identify. What we do know is that it was wrapped in a thick, doughy shell, sealed with the kind of optimism that only existed in the face of medieval starvation. Now, the thing about meat pies was that they were portable, which made them the perfect snack for a festival. You could carry them in one hand while waving around a wooden sword or clutching a jug of beer in the other. One bite into that pie, and you were probably getting a mixture of tough meat, questionable gravy, and the occasional surprise like a bit of gristle that would make you question your life choices. But in a world where your other option might be the local public fountain, aka the village's bath, that meat pie was gourmet. Next up, spiced ale. In medieval times, this wasn't a fancy craft brew with hops and barley, mind you. No, this was a heavy, slightly sour concoction, sometimes spiked with herbs, fruit, and whatever else could be thrown into a brew barrel. Its consistency ranged from watery to thick enough to eat with a spoon. The flavor was, well, it was what you needed it to be to survive the next few hours. Was it ideal? Number? But was it drinkable? Absolutely. You'd have it with everything from your meat pie to your fried dough, and it was best consumed in large quantities to drown out the thoughts of questionable food hygiene and the state of your poor, neglected stomach. Speaking of fried dough, let's talk about that. This was the food of champions, the unsung hero of every medieval festival. Imagine dough sweet, dense, and greasy fried up right in front of you, often dunked in honey or rolled in sugar. No one really knew what went into the dough: flour, yeast, water. Who could say? But when it came out crispy on the outside, warm and gooey on the inside, it didn't matter. It was the medieval equivalent of a donut, but without the fanfare. You'd stuff it into your mouth while watching the drunken jester do cartwheels or dancing around the fire with your friends. Fried dough wasn't just a treat, it was a lifeline. It could fill the stomach when you couldn't afford a meat pie. You didn't have to question its origins. Was it stale? Probably. Was it from last night's leftovers? Maybe. But it was deep fried, golden brown, and coated in so much sugar that it could rival anything served in a modern-day carnival. The best part? You could hold it in your hand while joining in a game or two, which usually consisted of flinging pies at anyone who looked important enough to need a good pieing. But let's not kid ourselves. Medieval festivals weren't exactly known for their hygiene. The food was often prepared with all the care and sanitation of a pigsty, and yet no one cared. When hunger strikes, even the least appetizing food can be transformed into something close to divine. Sure, that meat pie smells a little off. But that's fine, you tell yourself. It's probably just the spices. And that spiced ale, well, it may have a tang of sourness that might make your stomach turn, but it's been brewed with wild yeast, which is exactly how your ancestors drank it, right? Why not? So you take a deep breath, swallow your doubts, and go for another bite. It's festival food. What do you expect? But it wasn't all doom and gloom. There was a special joy that came with festival food, the mere act of indulging in it, surrounded by music, games, and the general chaos of medieval life, was like a temporary break from the otherwise grueling existence. No one was thinking about the fact that they hadn't bathed in days, or that their teeth were probably suffering from centuries of medieval dental care. No. The food was a small, fleeting piece of comfort, a reminder that despite the chaos and difficulty of life, there were moments that made it all seem worth it. And don't forget the social aspect of these meals. The festivals were a time of communal eating, which meant that everyone in the village, from the highest lord to the lowest serf, shared the same food and same space. There was an unspoken equality in this. Sure, the lord might have had more pies and better wine, but when you were all huddled together, stuffing your faces with fried dough and hot meat, the fact that you had to work the fields tomorrow seemed like a problem for tomorrow. As for the games and distractions that came with the food, well, they only added to the joy. Throwing pies was considered a fair game for anyone with a good arm and a questionable aim. You could hurl one at a friend, a passing minstrel, or even a local noble, who had all but resigned themselves to being a target at this point. It wasn't about being a good shot. It was about letting off steam, being part of the revelry, and getting a good laugh at the expense of someone else. Of course, no one was going to throw pies at the king, but throwing them at his closest advisors? Well, that was another story entirely. When all was said and done, medieval festival food may not have been gourmet, but it served its purpose. It was comforting, filling, and, at least for a brief moment, gave you a reason to smile while you wiped the last of that pie off your face. It didn't matter that the pie wasn't perfect, or that the ale tasted like it might have come from the local swamp. What mattered was that you were there, in the middle of the chaos, laughing, eating, and enjoying a moment of joy before returning to the often bleak existence that awaited outside the festival gates. The food wasn't just sustenance. It was a part of the festival experience, a moment of indulgence amidst the hardship of medieval life. You could laugh, you could sing, and you could share with your neighbors. Sure, your stomach might grumble later from the mismatched flavors, but in that moment, you were part of something bigger than yourself, and that was enough. Amid the smell of roasting meat and the cheerful chaos of festival life, there were the games. And let's be honest, these weren't your average backyard activities, oh no. These were the medieval equivalent of a blood-pumping, thrill-inducing, slightly ridiculous test of strength, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. Picture this. You've just eaten half a meat pie that may or may not have been questionable, chugged some spiced ale that's almost strong enough to kill the plague, and now? Now it's time to prove your worth with a good old-fashioned contest. First off, let's talk about jousting. Oh yes, the granddaddy of medieval games. Jousting was the sport of kings, knights, and anyone who had the misfortune of being roped into it. Imagine two armored knights charging toward each other at breakneck speed, lances aimed directly at the other's face, all in the name of honor, glory, and entertainment. What could possibly go wrong? Well, aside from the fact that you were charging at full speed while riding a horse and wielding a giant spear that was about to collide with another person wielding the same, yeah, not much. The thrill of jousting wasn't just about skill, it was about spectacle. The crowd roared, the horses neighed, and at least half the spectators were secretly hoping someone would be unseated from their steed. Because, let's face it, a knight falling off his horse was a far more exciting spectacle than someone simply winning. However, it wasn't all high-flying action and adrenaline. A bad hit, a misplaced lance, or a poorly timed maneuver could end with a knight flat on their back, staring up at the sky and wondering if it was worth the risk. And when you get thrown off a horse at full speed, well, let's just say medieval health insurance didn't exactly cover humiliation and bruises from head to toe. Then, of course, there were the simpler, yet equally dangerous games. Sack races were a fan favorite. Nothing says medieval fun quite like hopping around in a burlap sack while trying not to trip over your own feet, especially when you're competing against a group of peasants who have never even seen a race, let alone run one. You can imagine how that went. The sack, heavy and rough, would only add to the chaos, and if you weren't careful, you'd be face first in the mud before you could even finish a lap. But the true glory of winning a sack race wasn't the fame. It was the sheer joy of being able to say, yeah, I hopped in a sack, and I'm still standing. Beat that. Next up, tug of war. You might be thinking, how hard can it be? But you've never tried to pull a rope while standing on uneven, muddy ground, surrounded by people who've clearly eaten more than their fair share of fried dough. And let's not forget, you're competing against a team that might have a few local farmers on it, with arms like tree trunks. So, there you are, tugging with all your might, and just when you think you might be winning, the other team pulls back with a vengeance, sending you face first into a muddy puddle. It wasn't a question of strength. It was a question of endurance. Who could hang on longer before slipping, sliding, and getting unceremoniously dunked into the muck? Now, let's talk about mock battles. These were, perhaps, the most absurd of all the festival contests. Imagine a bunch of villagers, armed with wooden swords, shielded with hay bales, and the only rule being that no one gets seriously injured. Easier said than done, right? The idea behind these mock battles was simple. Fight for the glory of your village. while wearing armor that was mostly just straw stuffed into a burlap sack. The concept was meant to show off bravery without actually killing anyone. But there was always that one guy who forgot the mock part and ended up bruising his ego and everything else in the process. The crowd, naturally, loved it. There was something utterly thrilling about watching people flail about with sticks and wooden shields, pretending they were knights while trying not to die from the sheer embarrassment of it all. And what about the gambling? Oh yes, in the midst of all the physical chaos, there were bets being placed. Everyone had their own system, usually based on superstition or the pure thrill of risk on who would win which contest. Maybe you'd bet a few coins on the jousting match, or perhaps you'd put down your last loaf of bread on the sack race. Nothing said medieval fun like the chance of losing your dinner or your last penny. Of course, if you were a peasant, your gamble wasn't always on something that high stakes, but it was thrilling nonetheless. Some festivals had simple dice games. Others had spinning wheels or betting on who could consume the most pies without passing out. Whether you won or lost, the thrill of the gamble was a large part of the fun, and admittedly, a lot of the stress too. Losing a bet could mean going home hungry for the next week, but that wasn't enough to stop the laughter or the excitement. At the end of the day, winning any of these contests earned you glory, bragging rights, and maybe a few coins, if you were lucky. But losing, of course, meant a bruised ego, and the slow realization that your knee-jerk reaction to a half-baked game was now a legend of its own, whispered about by tavern-goers and fellow peasants for weeks to come. Still, at least you could comfort yourself with the knowledge that you were part of something bigger than your individual defeat. You were contributing to the merry chaos of the festival, to the shared laughter, and, most importantly, to the cultural celebration that brought everyone together. Yes, these games were ridiculous. Yes, they often ended in disaster, whether it was a twisted ankle from the sack race, a face full of mud from tug of war, or a bruised pride from being trounced in the mock battle. But what these events provided, beyond injury and insult, was a much-needed escape from the endless grind of medieval life. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, lord or peasant. At the festival, we were all the same. And for just a few fleeting moments, we were all winners, no matter who got their face in the dirt, who lost their lunch after one too many fried pies, or who misjudged the weight of their wooden sword. The point was that, for a short time, everyone got to forget their hardships and participate in something bigger than themselves. The festivals weren't just about competing. They were about community, shared joy, and letting loose in a world where letting loose wasn't a luxury afforded to most people. So, whether you were the one who got dunked in the mud or the one who emerged victorious, you were part of the laughter, the thrill, and the madness of the festival. And that, for a peasant, was as close to heaven as they'd ever get. Amid the chaos of games, food, and the occasional errant pie to the face, another form of festival magic was unfolding: music and dance. If the festivals were a celebration of medieval life, then music was the heartbeat, and dance was the pulse. The streets, filled with the heady scents of roasting meats and sugary confections, also carried the sounds of fiddles, drums, and the sometimes questionable tunefulness of an over-enthusiastic minstrel. The festival wasn't just a break from the grind of farm life. It was a moment to let loose, to enjoy the rhythm of life, and to indulge in a bit of chaos, accompanied by a soundtrack of lively tunes. Now, the medieval equivalent of a concert wasn't exactly a quiet affair. No, in the streets of the festival, the music was loud, brash, and often as wild as the crowd it entertained. You had your minstrels, of course, strumming lutes and plucking at harps as though the fate of the kingdom rested on their next chord. Some of them were actually quite skilled, others not so much. But either way, you weren't there for the technical proficiency. You were there for the spectacle. And then there were the drummers. Oh yes, the drummers. If there's one thing that's guaranteed to get your blood pumping and your feet moving, it's the sound of a drum beating faster than your own heartbeat. These drummers didn't play to soothe the soul. They played to shake it out of you. It didn't matter if you were wearing your Sunday best or your ragged tunic. When those drums started, you couldn't help but stomp your feet and swing your arms like the very rhythm of the universe was forcing you into a dance you didn't know you could do. And as for the dance, well, let's just say it was a free-for-all. The dances were often simple, straightforward, and prone to a fair bit of chaos. A circle of peasants in their ragged clothes would form, arms linked, stomping in time to the music, shouting and laughing as they spun around. The more daring might take it upon themselves to leap into the center of the circle, twirling and spinning as though they were the next great knight of the realm, albeit without the armor and with significantly less grace. But the point wasn't to look good. It was to have fun, to forget the world, and to momentarily be a part of something bigger than your daily struggles. And then, of course, there were the acrobats and jesters. Oh, the jesters. Picture it, a jester with a motley of brightly colored clothes performing ridiculous stunts in the middle of the square, all while juggling wooden clubs or attempting feats of agility that defied common sense. Some of them were rather skilled at their craft, throwing their bodies into the air with what seemed like reckless abandon. Others, well, let's just say their acrobatics were more about the thrill of the crowd than actual physical talent. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the laughter, the joy, and the sheer unpredictability of it all. One minute, you might be watching a jester try and fail to balance on one foot while holding a bottle of wine, and the next, you'd be clutching your sides, doubled over with laughter, as he slipped on a banana peel, or its medieval equivalent. The humor was often slapstick, sometimes crude, but always with an infectious energy that spread like wildfire. If you were lucky, you'd be pulled into one of the impromptu skits or silly games that the street performers would throw together, making you part of the entertainment in ways you never thought possible. Let's not forget the dancing. Oh yes, the dancing. Sure, there was the spontaneous circle-style dancing, where everyone hopped around like chickens in a coop. But there were also organized dances, too often around the maypole. Picture the scene. A crowd of townsfolk gathered around a tall, decorated pole, weaving ribbons in and out as they danced in synchronized patterns. It was charming, quaint, and not without its hazards. The ribbons were often longer than they looked, meaning you could very easily get tangled in a knot of colored string, tripping over your own feet while desperately trying to impress the village girls with your footwork. And yet, you danced on. After all, the maypole dance was as much about the community as it was about the moves. Everyone participated, young or old, and you didn't get out of it just because you were a little clumsy. And then there was the other kind of dance, the dance of chaos. These were the moments when the festival crowd, fueled by ale and the sheer joy of a day free from hard labor, would throw themselves into the streets, dancing however they liked. You could have a group of farmers attempting to do the waltz, a nobleman trying to prove his worth in front of a crowd, or a pair of sisters twirling around so fast that they risked falling into the roasting pit. But it didn't matter. The point was that everyone was free, if only for a moment, to act like a fool without consequence. In fact, the whole idea of dancing at medieval festivals was more about letting go than about showing off. There were no perfectly choreographed moves, no judges awarding trophies. If you could hop, jump, or spin without tripping over your own feet, you were considered a success. It didn't matter if you were the lord of the manor or a peasant from the next village over when. The music played. Everyone had the same right to step into the circle and lose themselves in the beat. Now, let's not forget the street performers, who often played a role in these festivities. They were the lifeblood of medieval festivals, turning a simple celebration into a true spectacle. Whether it was a fire breather, a contortionist, or a magician. Yes, magic was a real thing back then. At least in the eyes of the peasants, these entertainers brought a touch of the exotic and the unexpected to the streets. Watching someone breathe fire or perform an illusion was a mesmerizing experience. You'd find yourself standing there with your mouth hanging open, wondering how they did it, and maybe even considering for a brief moment that the magic was real. But more than that, the street performers served as a kind of social glue. They brought people together. They entertained the children while the adults chatted over mugs of ale. They lightened the mood in times of trouble, providing the simple joy of a shared experience. And in a world that often felt like it was filled with struggle, hardship, and endless work, these performers were the few moments of whimsy that gave everyone a chance to breathe, to smile, and to forget about the endless grind of everyday life. And here's the thing. Medieval festivals weren't just about the games or the dancing or the food. They were about the community, the coming together of people from all walks of life to celebrate something beyond themselves. For a few days, everyone was equal. The Lord might be there, but so was the lowly peasant. The knight, the baker, the merchant, they all shared the same space, the same joy, and the same ridiculousness. In the middle of a festival, you could be anyone. Your job, your wealth, your status all melted away in the heat of the dancing, the music, and the carefree revelry. And maybe that was the real magic of it all. It wasn't the fire breathers or the jesters or the fancy food. It was the sense of unity. In a world where peasants worked from sunup to sundown, where illness and famine lurked around every corner, the festival was a reminder of the simple joy of being alive, of being together, and of having just a little bit of fun. So, whether you were dancing, eating, watching a juggler fail miserably at his craft, or just enjoying the sight of your neighbor trying to do the Macarena in a donkey mask, you were part of something far bigger than yourself. You were part of a tradition that, in some ways, hasn't changed all that much over the centuries. Festivals, with their wild abandon and their sense of joy, are still a part of human life today. And in the medieval world, they were nothing short of essential. And so, we danced, we ate, and we laughed. Maybe we even fell in the mud a few times, or ended up with a pie in our face. But at least we were alive to tell the tale. And for a peasant, that was the real victory. Now, after the pies, the dancing, and the strange, often suspicious street snacks, the real heart of many medieval festivals was religion. Yes, that's right. The moment when the peasants and the lords alike could come together to celebrate saints, gods, and occasionally, to forget that there was actually work to do tomorrow. You see, in the medieval world, religion was everything. It governed not just your morals, but your social calendar. Most festivals and holidays were religious in origin. Each one a commemoration of a saint's day, a harvest, blessing, or the changing seasons as seen through a very, very devout lens. These were times when the work in the fields could be put aside, and the whole community could, for just a little while, relax and celebrate their faith, and occasionally, indulge in a bit of indulgence. The kind that maybe didn't sit too well with the priest, but they didn't mind much after a few flagons of ale. Let's start with saints' days. These were big deals. Every saint had their own special day. One saint might get a whole month dedicated to them, while others had only one day to shine. But no matter the saint, every village, every town would mark the occasion in some way. For the peasants, this meant attending the local church for a long, drawn-out mass, which was full of chanting, incense, and prayers. It was spiritual, of course, but if you weren't careful, you might end up nodding off halfway through, especially if you'd had a little too much ale the night before. Still, these saints weren't just abstract figures up in the sky. They were your patrons, your guardians, and so, on their special day, you made sure to honor them in the most fitting way possible, with offerings of food, maybe a bit of coin, and certainly some loud, joyful revelry afterward. And by revelry, we mean a sort of mix of devotion and debauchery. You see, medieval festivals weren't exactly all solemn and prayerful. While the Mass took place inside the church, the festivities outside could get, well, rowdy. Easter was another festival that had a particular blend of spirituality and celebration. Yes, the resurrection of Christ was at the core of it, but for peasants, Easter also meant food lots of it. After weeks of fasting, or living on bread and simple pottage, the feast day was a welcome reprieve. People would gather for Easter processions, walking through the town, carrying candles and singing hymns, all the while eyeing the tables that would soon be groaning under the weight of roasted meats, pies, and sweet cakes. Oh, the cakes! And the sweet wine! It was the one time in the year where the common folk could truly indulge in a feast fit for a king, and who would argue that they didn't deserve it after all those months of hard work? But don't get too caught up in the idea of pious reflection. No Easter had its share of debauchery too. In fact, the line between devotion and indulgence is often blurred. After the serious religious bits were done, it was time for the fun parts, the drinking, the dancing, and the general abandonment of any semblance of self-control. The drinking was never just a little either. It was the kind of drinking where the ale flowed as freely as the prayers. The night would continue. The villagers would dance and sing with a joy that only a day of indulgence could bring. Some might even don costumes and engage in mock fights, or create rituals that had more to do with letting off steam than honoring Christ. But let's face it, Sometimes a little bit of well-meaning chaos was exactly what the day needed. In the harvest festivals, well, this was when things really started to get messy literally. The harvest was a time of Thanksgiving, and who could blame the peasants for wanting to celebrate after spending months planting, weeding, and hoping for good weather? They weren't just thankful for the crops, they were thankful for survival. A good harvest meant enough food for the winter, while a bad one meant everyone was hungry, and no one wanted to think about that. The festival usually started with prayers for good weather, followed by processions to bless the crops, but quickly descended into a scene straight out of a medieval dream. The local farmers would have gathered to sing, dance, and feast on whatever was freshly harvested, usually bread, cheese, and whatever meats could be spared. But it wasn't just about food and drink, it was about the community. Everyone from the youngest child to the oldest grandfather would join in. The dance was wild and uninhibited. The whole village would come together and make merry, often with a bit too much ale flowing by the end of the day. And for the lucky ones, there might even be a few traveling minstrels and performers who'd been hired to provide entertainment, including jesters, acrobats, or musicians. But of course, the true fun lay in what happened after the work of prayer and celebration. If you think the modern world's idea of work hard, play hard is anything new, think again. In the medieval period, play often meant a bit more than just singing and dancing. This was the time for everyone to let loose. And let's be honest, there were more than a few games of chance, or drinking competitions, or the kind of mischief that could only happen when everyone's guard was down. And if you happened to pass out in the field after a few too many pints, well, then it was just a sign of a festival well done. However, the line between festivity and disorder was a little too thin for comfort. Church officials would often frown on this wild indulgence, preaching that such worldly pleasures were distractions from spiritual growth. But for the peasants, the feast was far more about survival, joy, and community than piety. There's only so much waiting for eternal life a person can do while living in a drafty hut with rats chewing at the corners of your bed. Religious festivals were certainly meant to bring joy, but they often became the perfect excuse for a little rebellion against the daily grind. Whether it was the masses of people in the streets or the food vendors loudly hawking their wares, the feeling of unity and camaraderie was undeniable. It didn't matter what your rank was. If you were in the square during the harvest festival, you were part of something bigger than yourself. Sure, there was dancing and singing, but drinking and revelry were just as important for keeping spirits high. In fact, these festivals served as the rare breaks from the crushing toil of daily life, where peasants could breathe a little easier, forget their burdens, and pretend to be something other than just the worker. And you know what? As much as the priests grumbled about it, deep down, they were probably just happy they got a little extra wine, too. After all, nothing says holy day like a hearty meal and an ale-soaked sing-along. As long as the bishop doesn't see you sneaking that second pie slice, it's all good, right? Now, let's not kid ourselves. When it came to medieval festivals, the nobility wasn't just attending for the food and drink. Oh no, they had far grander ideas in mind. While peasants were there to eat, drink, dance, and possibly forget how much work awaited them the next day, the nobles had their own agenda: control, propaganda, and maybe, just maybe fun, if they were lucky. You see, nobles weren't just passive participants in festivals. They sponsored them, often with an eye toward displaying their power and wealth. And let's face it, what better way to show off your status than by throwing a grand public event that everyone could attend? A well-organized festival could serve as a glorious display of wealth and influence, with banners flying high, minstrels playing in the streets, and jugglers tossing pies through the air, all while the peasants dutifully offered their praise, and maybe a little more money in taxes, for the chance to be part of it. And this wasn't just for fun. The festival was a tool of social control. It wasn't uncommon for lords to use the occasion to reinforce their dominance. Public parades often took center stage, with the lord or duke leading the procession, showing off not just their fancy garb, but their ever-growing fortune. Peasants, of course, were invited to witness this display of power, cheering, bowing, and even clapping for their noble overlords as they passed by. In a world where hierarchy and class mattered more than life itself, this could remind everyone of their place. A reminder that while peasants might work the land, it was the nobles who controlled it. And let's talk about parades for a second. Feudal parades were a staple of medieval festivals. where the nobility would ride through town on horseback, waving to their subjects like an early version of the royal tour. But this wasn't just a public relations stunt. Oh no, these parades were an art of visual storytelling. They were about showing the peasants, in no uncertain terms, that their lords were not just landowners. They were wielders of power. And what better way to show this power than by literally parading it in front of a crowd of sweaty peasants, some of whom might not even have shoes on their feet. But let's not forget, the whole thing cost money. And guess who would pay for that? The peasants, of course. The nobility might have their castles and fine wine, but the real money often came from taxes. And what better way to justify those tax hikes than a fun-filled festival? The lords made sure that everyone participated in the event, but not without first ensuring that their pockets were lined. Entry fees were common, and if you wanted to take part in the games, the drinking, or, heaven forbid, the jousting tournament, you'd better be ready to hand over a few coins. But let's talk about the true spectacle of the event. The games. Oh yes, the games. Nobles might throw a jousting competition to show off their horsemanship skills or sponsor a mock battle that was, let's face it, a glorified way to entertain the masses while reminding them that the nobility could afford to play at war. And of course, these games were more than just sports. They were a demonstration of superiority. Peasants could watch as knights or manorial officials battled it out in elaborate, staged fights, their shiny armor reflecting the wealth and status that peasants could only dream of. If you were lucky enough to be chosen to participate as a humble jouster or swordsman in a mock melee, you could win glory, and sometimes a small stipend if you were fortunate enough. But mostly, you were there to provide the entertainment, not to have fun yourself. Taxes and payments weren't the only things that the nobility took from the peasants in the name of festival fun. Labor was also frequently extracted. The peasants weren't just there to watch the festivities. They were often the unsung labor force behind them. They were the ones who would build the temporary stalls, prepare the food, and most importantly, clean up after the whole spectacle had ended. It was classic medieval exploitation. The lords get the fun and glory, and the peasants get the dirty work. But of course, this wasn't just about hard labor. It was about sacrifice. Your participation in the festival was seen as part of your duty to your lord, as if giving your time and sweat to the event was your personal contribution to the lord's legacy. Now, what about the actual festivities? Yes, the nobles were busy ensuring they were gloriously represented, but the peasants? Well, they still got a little something out of it. Street food vendors, carnivals, and game stalls were a huge part of these events. Yes, there were the games and the shows, but the true fun for the peasantry often came in the form of food, drink, and the brief moment where, just for a second, they could feel as though they had more than just survival to look forward to. The noblemen might have had their elaborate feasts and 5-course meals, but peasants could buy their own feast in a pie, ale in a barrel, and a chance to see the world beyond the fields they worked. Imagine paying taxes to watch peasants chase a pig while juggling bread politics in motion. At least you can say you sponsored the whole affair while eating half of your month's wages in food. The peasants had a chance to see you, but they weren't allowed to join you in your VIP section, because why would you ever want the help to be part of the fun? Festivals in the medieval era weren't just about food, drink, and merrymaking. Oh no, they were as much about chaos and calamity as they were about celebrating the harvest or honoring saints. Imagine for a moment the madness of these festivals. Thousands of peasants, drunk on poor ale, wearing ridiculous costumes, dancing and singing in the streets, all while animals roamed free and the occasional fight broke out over who would take home the last bit of pie. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? And you'd be right. Now, where do we start? Perhaps with the alcohol. Medieval ale wasn't your craft brewed IPA served in a sleek glass mug. No, this was thick, sour, and warm. It was basically a liquid loaf of bread, but with a higher alcohol content and a lower level of sanitation. For most peasants, it was their main form of sustenance. So, add that to a whole day of feasting, music, and dancing. And what do you get? Drunken chaos. It didn't take much for the mood to shift from jovial celebration to all-out mayhem. Maybe someone's pie got knocked over in the crowd, or a particularly rowdy peasant tried to start a dance-off and ended up kicking someone's foot into the nearest wooden cart. Whatever the cause, once that first brawl broke out, it was like opening a can of worms. Suddenly, fists were flying, and the party mood was over. Fights at these festivals were as common as the food stalls. These weren't fancy squabbles over minor inconveniences. No, medieval peasants didn't hold back. They fought over who got to hold the last jug of mead, or more often than not, who'd been cut in line at the food stalls. And let's not forget the insults, the kind of crude words that, when shouted across a crowded street, could start a full-blown brawl in a matter of seconds. The whole thing would erupt, often leaving the town square in a complete state of confusion. Now, imagine the town authorities. Were they there to stop the madness? Not likely. Oh no, the local constable probably had more pressing things to worry about, like making sure the tax collectors didn't get mobbed or chasing after a runaway horse. So, for the most part, the peasants had to fend for themselves. And let's just say, it didn't always end peacefully. And then there were the animals. Not only did pigs roam free in the middle of the street, but there were often goats and horses causing their own havoc. These creatures, often more accustomed to open fields than crowded town squares, would get spooked by the loud noise and frantic energy of the crowd. And boom, instant chaos. Picture this: a drunken crowd of peasants trying to keep their footing while a goat does its best impression of a bull in a china shop, knocking over tables and sending food flying in every direction. Now, imagine trying to chase after that goat to corral it, only to have it dart under a nearby cart, effectively blocking your path. And don't even get me started on the pigs. It wasn't unusual for peasants to let their pigs loose during these festivities, either as part of a game or simply as a moment of carelessness. As any seasoned festival goer would tell you, pigs on the loose are basically a town-wide disaster in the making. Then, of course, there was the crowd. With so many people crammed together, there were bound to be injuries. You had the occasional peasant who would trip on a misplaced bucket, someone who'd get accidentally elbowed in the face during an impromptu jig, and the all-too-common issues of drunkards falling into the fire pits or stumbling over tables. If you were unfortunate enough to be caught in the middle of one of these crowds, you'd likely find yourself tangled in a web of chaos, squashed between overzealous dancers, struggling to catch your breath while avoiding a half-eaten pie thrown in your face. Ah, yes, festivals were a place of chaotic camaraderie. If you weren't in a fight, you were certainly in someone else's accident. If you were a child, well, things weren't much better. The risk of being caught underfoot by an adult in a blind, drunken stupor or being knocked over by the herd of kids playing nearby was very real. But that's what made these festivals so intoxicating. The possibility of something unexpected happening. One moment, you were dancing with your friends, and the next, you were staring down at a goat's rear end, trying to avoid getting the rest of your food trampled. It wasn't elegant or graceful, but it sure kept things interesting. And then there were the animals. Yes, I said animals again. This time, we're talking about dogs and horses. These weren't just random farm animals either. They were used in the games, often being let loose to run through obstacles or even participate in games like Catch the Pig or Run the Race. Not only did these animals sometimes cause chaos in the streets, but they also served as a reminder that these festivals were very much a reflection of a wild and untamed world. Animals weren't just props. They were a part of the spectacle. So, if you survived the drunken chaos, dodged a goat, and somehow escaped injury, then you could still be guaranteed one thing. By the end of the day, there was a very real chance you'd be in a crowd-wide mess. It could be pie in the face, fights breaking out in the middle of the square, or lost shoes in a river of ale. It was a spectacle of madness, and no one was really spared. You could lose a finger, a horse, or your dignity, all before lunchtime. One minute, you're watching the pigs race, and the next, you're dodging an angry goat trying to grab a handful of stale bread and wondering if you'll make it to the feast without tripping over a passed-out peasant. It was a test of survival, and sometimes the worst thing that could happen was you ending up in a pie fight you didn't sign up for. Now, this wonderful festival chaos didn't just stop at physical mayhem. No, no, no. These festivals also had their fair share of moral consequences, particularly when things got a little too wild. But that's a story for later. Just remember, medieval festivals weren't all fun and games. Sometimes they were just a bit of mayhem, some accidental injuries, and a whole lot of running from angry goats. Still, they kept people coming back for more. Amidst the revelry, drunken brawls, and the occasional runaway goat, there was another side to medieval festivals: the buzzing, clinking, and haggling of the marketplace. The festival grounds were more than just a stage for merrymaking. They were commercial hubs where the economic pulse of the town came alive. This was where peasants, traders, and artisans gathered not just to socialize, but to barter, sell, and shop for all the things that made life a little more bearable, be it a warm loaf of bread, a new tunic, or even a few trinkets to make life more interesting. Temporary stalls and booths popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, offering everything from roasted goose to cheap leather goods. And let's not forget the ever-popular sweets, because even in the midst of all the back-breaking work and uncertainty, someone was still figuring out how to deep-fry dough and drizzle it with honey. It wasn't all about food and drink, though. Merchants came from far and wide, displaying their handmade wares, from crafted tools, wooden trinkets, hand-stitched garments, to the occasional shiny bauble that the local peasants could only dream of affording. It was a mix of local farmers trying to sell their fresh vegetables, artisans showing off their fine leatherwork, and the occasional traveling trader selling something truly bizarre like, say, a magic potion or a questionable feather that was supposed to bring you luck. What luck, exactly, was anyone's guess. The marketplace was also a place for bartering, and you better believe it wasn't all smooth sailing. In fact, it was a bit like a game of social chess. Coins, goods, even services, everything was up for negotiation. For instance, you could haggle for your bread, but instead of the usual, "How much for a loaf?" you might find yourself negotiating a sack of wheat for a rooster you didn't even want. Oh, and don't forget to bring a charming smile because, believe me, no one trusts a stone-faced peasant when it's time to haggle. There were also those notorious traveling traders who peddled their wares with just a little too much enthusiasm, whispering stories of how their jewels could cure everything from broken bones to broken hearts. Though, of course, the heartbroken usually ended up with roasted chestnuts instead. Humorous observation. Buy a roasted goose, haggle for a feather, and hope your coin purse isn't stolen by the town jester. That's festival shopping, medieval style. It's like supermarket sweep, except your biggest worry isn't expired coupons. It's getting pickpocketed by someone who's been too busy stuffing their face with fried dough. Then there were the artisan crafts, which were more than just beautiful to look at. For some, they represented hard-earned skill and labor passed down from father to son. Take the woodworkers, for example. Some of these tradesmen would carefully carve out everything from sturdy wooden spoons to intricately designed furniture, with a level of craftsmanship that made even the most modest bowl seem like a work of art. Other artisans might be selling handmade candles, leather boots, or hand-woven blankets. But no matter the craft, these goods were the kind of thing that couldn't be made overnight. They were built on hours of labor, creativity, and the occasional bit of gossip about the local lord's wife. Markets weren't only about buying things, though. They were also places of social interaction. As you wandered through the bustling stalls, you'd notice everyone from the local butcher to the village blacksmith catching up with their friends and neighbors. Bartering was a great excuse to chat, and the occasional loud argument over prices made for the kind of entertainment you couldn't find at the tavern. But, let's be honest, there was always some suspicious-looking merchant who somehow had just the thing you didn't know you needed. A mysterious trinket, a spicy concoction, or a weathered map that made absolutely no sense but promised to lead you to treasure. And in these moments, the local economy was a strange mix of consumerism, chaos, and community. It was a place where money changed hands, but trust was even more valuable. As for peasants, they weren't just spending their meager wages on festivals or food. No, they were also looking for essentials, things like tools to help with the harvest or repairs. It was a simple and yet crucial exchange. A farmer needed a new plow, and in return, he might trade a basket of eggs or even his farming labor for a couple of hours. It wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping life running smoothly and taking care of business, one barter at a time. Now, here's the real fun. The town jester. Festivals weren't complete without someone to make the crowd laugh and maybe even reflect on the silliness of it all. The jester's job wasn't just to entertain. It was to make fun of everyone. Kings, lords, peasants, everyone was a target, and these jokers didn't hold back. Ever hear of a joke about a lord's wife or the mayor's new tunic? Trust me, the peasants didn't care. They loved it. Laughter was their respite, and the jester, their hero. But don't think these jesters just spouted off jokes. Oh no, they were masters of social commentary. They used humor to highlight the absurdities of medieval life, Who else could get away with making fun of the lords? Certainly not a regular peasant. No, the jester held power in a strange, twisted way. A joke about the royal family might be the one thing the peasants could enjoy without the risk of being sent to the stocks. And as the sun began to set on these merry days, the market stalls were slowly packed away, the drunkards stumbled off to their homes, and the town square, now littered with crumbled pies and discarded costume pieces, slowly returned to its more familiar, quiet state. But for those few hours, the entire town had participated in something larger than life, a celebration, a feast, a release from the unrelenting weight of the everyday. The festival ended, the jester retired, and everyone stumbled home, their pockets a little lighter, their stomachs a little fuller, and their faces a little more flushed from the ruckus. You could almost hear them whispering, "Same time next year, right?" It's hard to look at modern-day festivals, carnivals, and Christmas markets without seeing a little bit of medieval flair. Sure, we've traded in the dancing goats for clown performances and parades, but at their core, these events are still about one thing: coming together as a community to celebrate life, laughter, and a bit of chaos. Take the carnival or Christmas market, for instance. What are they really, if not modern-day echoes of the medieval fairs? Much like those ancient feast days, we now flock to these vibrant gatherings, excited to sample overpriced food, indulge in some low-stakes gambling, and laugh at the games of chance that seem just a little too rigged to be real. And let's not forget the vendors, who've now swapped out those roasted goose legs for funnel cakes and cotton candy. But the spirit is undeniably similar. Both offer food on a stick, albeit with slightly different flavors. The medieval fairs of the past weren't just about the fun and games, though those were certainly part of the equation. They were about social connections, cultural exchange, and a chance for the peasants to forget their constant struggles for a little while. Sure, there were still work-related obligations to meet, and you couldn't exactly ignore your chores in exchange for some carnival time. But for a few hours, or even a few days, medieval peasants were given the gift of community. They were allowed to put aside the back-breaking work, the plague, the constant threat of starvation, and simply celebrate life. The joy was a reprieve, a momentary escape that, despite all its chaos, was essential for the spirit of survival. Now, jump to today. Carnivals and festivals might look a little more polished, but the essential human need for celebration remains. Whether it's Christmas markets offering mulled wine and handcrafted goods, or a local carnival where you can win a stuffed bear after 24 attempts, the purpose is the same. Reconnect with your neighbors, share in the joy, and remember that life is worth celebrating, even in tough times. But the influence doesn't stop there. Modern Christmas markets, which often feel like a nostalgic nod to medieval merriment, owe a lot to the winter festivals of the past. Those events were often marked by feasting, gift-giving, and of course, drinking to excess. The bustling market stalls, the smell of warm pastries wafting through the cold air, the sounds of carolers singing. It's all a direct descendant of those ancient gatherings where communities came together to mark the end of the year with a mix of pagan traditions and Christian beliefs. Peasants might have enjoyed the feast days and marketplaces with a bit of trepidation, but now we happily embrace those same traditions, albeit with a bit more shopping and a lot less plague. Medieval festivals were also a boisterous celebration of community, much like our modern town fairs. In these festivals, local artisans would proudly display their crafts, be it pottery, hand-woven fabrics, or tapestries. And the same is true today at craft fairs and artisanal markets. Yes, the goods may have changed, but the purpose remains. The craftspeople who sold their wares at medieval fairs were the heart of their communities, offering their skills and expertise to a world that had far fewer options. In today's artisan marketplaces, we see the same pride in local craftsmanship and a desire for something handmade. It's a shared connection to the past, where community bonds were built on the exchange of goods, skills, and shared experiences. Let's not forget about the merry chaos that medieval festivals often invited. Games of chance, street performances, and the occasional flimsy scaffold erected just for fun. That's right. The medieval world was not shy about danger. Today's amusement parks, fairs, and circus performances might be more polished and safer. Thank you. Safety harnesses. But the core thrill of those experiences is rooted in the same desire for excitement. Modern rides might be much faster, and the clowns have traded in their silly costumes for more contemporary gimmicks. But the basic concept remains. Just as the medieval townsfolk took pride in their ability to laugh at dangerous performances and risk-taking, we today still find joy in the unpredictable, whether that's a roller coaster that might make your stomach flip or a prank gone wrong at a festival. Next time you eat cotton candy at a fair, thank the medieval peasants, or at least their questionable hygiene. So, the next time you're strolling through a Christmas market or taking your kids to a local carnival, think back to the medieval festivals that set the stage for these modern traditions. While our lives are certainly more comfortable, our desire for joy and community has not changed much since those dusty days when a town square was filled with screaming children, drunken jesters, and roasted pig heads. Even though we might not be wearing donkey masks or chasing pigs, we're still gathering to celebrate life. The tradition continues, and in the end, perhaps that's all we really need. A little laughter, a bit of chaos, and a whole lot of food, it turns out. We're just modern-day medieval peasants with better hygiene and less plague. As we wrap up our journey through the wild world of medieval festivals, it's impossible to ignore the sheer creativity and joy that these events sparked, despite the endless hardships of everyday medieval life. We've explored how peasants and nobles alike turned their suffering into celebration, creating a vibrant patchwork of traditions that still echo in the festivals we enjoy today. But beyond the pies, dancing goats, and questionable hygiene, there's something inherently human about this ability to turn chaos into celebration. Medieval peasants, who lived in the shadow of famine, disease, and backbreaking labor, still managed to find joy in community and ritual. They transformed their struggles into festivities, where food, drink, and games were not just about indulgence, but about survival, social survival, if not literal survival. After a long year of back-breaking work in the fields, they knew that a little bit of chaos and fun was not just a luxury, it was necessary. It was their release, their momentary escape from the grim realities of their daily lives. And this human need for celebration hasn't changed much. While we might not be chasing pigs through the streets or wearing goat masks, we still gather in our towns and cities for festivals, fairs, and celebrations of every kind. From carnivals to Christmas markets, we continue to embrace the same chaotic joy that our medieval ancestors once did. Sure, there's less risk of being hit in the face with a pie, but there's still something timeless about the way we find joy in the unpredictable, in the silly, and in the shared. It's not just about the food, or the drinks, or the games, though they certainly help. It's about coming together, breaking free from the monotony, and creating memories that transcend time. That's the true power of these festivals. The way they've always been a reflection of human resilience, the ability to find joy in the chaos, and to connect with others in ways that aren't defined by hardship, but by celebration. From the medieval town square to your local carnival, there's a profound continuity in our desire to celebrate life, no matter the circumstances. The legacy of those wild, pie-filled days still lingers. It's in the way we gather, the way we laugh, and the way we hold on to the idea that even in the darkest times, there's always space for laughter and community. So, next time you're at a festival, whether it's a carnival, a Christmas market, or just a local fair, remember the medieval revelers who once dodged pies and dancing animals with a grin? They weren't just marking time. They were making memories, finding joy, and surviving together. And honestly, isn't that what we're all still doing today? Next time you're at a festival, spare a thought for those medieval revelers dodging pies and pigs with a grin. Subscribe for more history that's strange, funny, and oddly inspiring. That's the end of our medieval festival journey, but don't worry, there's more quirky history waiting for you. If you enjoyed this little dive into the past, make sure to subscribe. And don't forget to check out other episodes where we'll continue to explore the wild, wonderful, and slightly ridiculous corners of history. Until next time, keep laughing, keep celebrating, and remember, it's the joy and the chaos that makes life truly worthwhile.